They say elephants never forget, but she did something even rarer. She forgave, not a human, not a herd, but fate itself, and gave her heart to the unlikeliest creature. The day her calf died, the forest went quiet, not from respect, not from fear, but from something older, something heavier, as if the trees themselves knew they were witnessing the moment a mother's world collapsed. She didn't move for hours, didn't blink. Her calf had been sick for days, slowly fading beneath the heat, the flies, and the helpless efforts of every ranger in the sanctuary. They had tried everything: fluids, shade, cooling baths. But when the final breath left his body, she had been the only one who didn't look away. She placed her trunk across his back, not to wake him, but to remember the weight. She rocked once, twice, then stood motionless, as if willing her own body to go still with him. The herd moved on, slowly, hesitantly. Some looked back. None returned, but she stayed. 2 days passed. The sun rose and fell, and still she remained, silent, unmoving, except for the occasional shift of her ears when the wind rustled through the grass. The rangers debated what to do. Some said intervene. Others said let her grieve. On the third morning, the scavengers came, circling high above, waiting. She stood then, not in surrender, but in refusal. She walked away from her calf without a sound, no trumpet, no cry, just the steady, sorrow-filled rhythm of footsteps that didn't belong to survival, but to something more profound. Something like surrender, not to death, but to the truth that it had come, and she hadn't been able to stop it. They thought she would follow the herd. She didn't. Instead, she turned away from them, from the trails, the waterhole, even the trees that had shaded her during birth. She disappeared into the brush. The rangers followed at a distance, uncertain. She wasn't acting erratic, just deliberate, focused. For days she wandered alone, and then, on the 6th day, she returned. But she wasn't alone. Tucked beneath her body, stumbling beside her legs, was a newborn, but not a calf, not even an elephant. A baby buffalo, still slick from birth, trembling, confused, its mother nowhere to be found. And she guarded it. Not like a curiosity, not like a mistake, but like it was hers. At first, no one believed it. The rangers thought she had stumbled upon a dying buffalo calf and was simply curious. Protective, perhaps, out of instinct, but temporary, unstable, a fluke. But when they approached to intervene, to rescue, as they put it, she turned on them. Not with rage, with purpose. She stood between the calf and the humans, her ears wide, her body still, her message unmistakable. He's mine. And that's when they knew. This wasn't confusion. This was adoption. What no one could explain was how. The species weren't compatible. Their sense, their sounds, their entire communication systems were different. The calf shouldn't have accepted her, and yet it followed her, limping through the brush, curling beneath her belly, reaching for her trunk the way a nursing elephant would for its mother's chest. She responded as if it were her own. She guided it gently with her trunk. She rumbled low when it panicked. She stood over it at night, swatting flies from its back. The rangers watched in silence, unsure whether to document or just witness. The herd returned days later, moving through the open plains with thunder in their feet. The matriarch paused when she saw her. The grieving mother turned guardian, now walking with a species no one had ever seen beside a wild elephant. There was tension. Elephants remember, and they do not forget what doesn't belong. The herd sniffed the calf, circled it. One of the older females stepped forward, nudged it harshly with her trunk. The baby stumbled. The mother roared. It was the first sound she had made since her own calf's death. A sound not of mourning, but of claim. The herd backed off, not in fear, but in awe. They didn't embrace the buffalo calf, not at first, but they accepted her decision, because grief was something they understood, and anyone who had lost a child earned the right to heal in their own way. And so, for the first time in the sanctuary's history, a herd of elephants roamed with an orphaned buffalo walking among them, nursed by an elephant, protected by giants, taught not how to be a buffalo, but how to be loved. And slowly something extraordinary happened. The calf began to thrive. He grew stronger, more curious. His trembling steps gave way to gallops. He would chase butterflies under the shadows of enormous feet. He would press his face into his surrogate mother's side and fall asleep, while she hummed low and slow, the same rhythm she had once used with the calf she buried. The rangers stopped asking why. They started asking how they had ever doubted her. But the world outside the sanctuary wasn't as gentle. News spread. Visitors came, some with wonder, some with mockery. "An elephant who thinks she's a buffalo, Mom?" they said. "It's not natural." But grief, the mother seemed to say, doesn't care what's natural. Grief makes new rules, and love rewrites them. Because what began as instinct became routine. What looked like grief evolved into grace. And over time, the sanctuary adjusted. Not the elephant, not the buffalo, but everything around them. They began to walk with rhythm. Where once the calf stumbled to keep up, now he led small gallops ahead, pausing to wait when she slowed. Where once she hovered over him protectively, now she gave him space, but never distance. He could wander, but never alone. Because no matter how far he strayed, she was always just behind him, watching, present, constant. And the herd, they followed her lead. They still didn't touch him. They still didn't rumble in his language. But they cleared space for him at the watering hole. They didn't challenge him for shade. And when predators approached the outer fence, it wasn't just the mother who stepped between him and the world. It was 5 tons of collective memory and muscle. The calf had become part of something no one believed possible. A herd of giants had made room for something so small, so different, simply because she loved him. And that love had changed them. Visitors no longer asked why. They began whispering, "Wow." Children pressed their hands to the glass at the edge of the reserve, not pointing at tusks or trunks, but at the tiny hornless creature nestled beneath a curtain of gray legs. Teachers stopped trying to explain the anomaly with biology. Instead, they used words like empathy, resilience, healing. Researchers came to study it, but stayed to feel it. Because no data could measure what was happening in that grove. No camera could fully capture the way that tiny calf would curl into the folds of his guardian's body like he had been born there. Because in every way that mattered, he had. He no longer flinched at thunder, no longer cried at night. He no longer waited for someone else to claim him, because she already had. And her love wasn't temporary. It didn't fade with time. It grew. Each time she stopped walking to let him catch up. Each time she gently guided him with her trunk away from danger. Each time she rumbled low when he curled into her side. Yes, the same rumble she had once used for another, but not as a replacement, as a continuation. Because love doesn't forget, it expands. And what she gave him wasn't borrowed affection. It was real, earned, enduring. Because real love, the kind that forms not from similarity, but from survival, doesn't fade when eyes turn away. It deepens in the quiet, it solidifies in the struggle, and hers had become legend. The Rangers began telling her story to new volunteers, not as a rare incident, but as a reminder that healing doesn't follow rules, that family isn't always biological, that motherhood isn't bound by species. The buffalo calf, once a trembling orphan unsure of the ground beneath him, became the sanctuary's heart. He no longer moved with hesitation, but with quiet confidence. He knew who he was, not by label, not by lineage, but by presence, by the fact that when he stumbled, someone was there to lift him. When he cried, someone rumbled back. And when he rested, he never did it alone. She watched him grow, watched him graze deeper into the trees, watched him learn how to follow the scent of rain, watched him challenge small birds like he was 10 times his size. And she never interfered. She only stood nearby, always nearby. And as she aged, he began watching her in return. He noticed the slight tremble in her legs after long walks, the deeper breaths at night, the way her ears tilted a little slower when sounds came from afar. So he stayed closer, rested when she did, walked slower when she lagged behind. And when she slept longer than usual, he curled against her, not as a child in need of protection, but as a protector himself. The cycle had reversed, but the bond never weakened. And somewhere in that, the sanctuary began to shift, not physically, but spiritually. Other animals who had once been labeled unbondable, unrehabilitatable, began forming strange and beautiful attachments. A crippled antelope who refused to eat unless beside a warthog, a macaque who curled up nightly beside a flightless hawk, and no one questioned it anymore. Because love, once proven across species and silence, no longer needed justification, it needed witnessing. And that grove where she had first returned with the calf, where she had stood silently while the world doubted, became a sacred space. No signs, no fences, just trees and light and memory. And every year, without fail, the grown buffalo returns there. Not because he remembers the moment, but because he remembers the feeling, the hum in the ground, the rhythm in the air, the silent language of a heart choosing another. It didn't speak in sound or signal. It didn't demand attention. It simply was, like the hush before a sunrise or the moment before rain touches dry earth. Unnoticed by most, but undeniable to those who stood close enough to feel it. And many did. Volunteers came and went. Rangers transferred, researchers rotated. But everyone who crossed paths with them, this unspoken pair, left different. Some couldn't explain it. Others tried to quantify it. But most just felt it, that this bond, formed in the ruins of grief, had become something sacred. Not because it broke the rules, but because it rewrote what was possible. The calf, now grown, became not just a symbol, but a story passed between generations. New arrivals to the sanctuary, both human and animal, were told not through files or lectures, but through soft footsteps to the grove, where someone would point and say, "That's where she brought him. That's where he stayed with her." That's where we all started to believe again. Belief, not just in recovery, but in restoration. Not just in survival, but in relationship. The herd, once hesitant, now moved as a collective that made room for outsiders. They weren't just protecting their own. They had grown to recognize the shapes of sorrow and make space beside them, just like she had. And though her steps grew slower and her eyes dimmer, she never stopped moving toward him. Even when arthritis claimed her joints, even when the younger elephants tried to guide her elsewhere, she would find her way back to him. And he never needed to be called. He knew when she wasn't near, and he always found her. They'd walk side by side, sometimes not even touching, but never far apart. He had stopped fitting beneath her years ago, but in his mind, in the way he waited for her every morning, in the way he lowered his body beside hers every night, he was still her calf, and she was still his mother. And what they had built, quietly without explanation, had started to echo beyond the fences. Other sanctuaries heard of them. Schools taught lessons about them. People who had never believed animals could feel this deeply began to rethink everything. Because somewhere in the world, a grieving mother had once chosen to open her heart again. And because of that choice, a life had not only been saved, it had become a reason for others to live differently, to pause, to stay, to choose love even when it made no sense at all. That's what she had done, not out of instinct, not because anyone told her to, but because something within her refused to let another creature disappear the way her calf had. She hadn't replaced what she lost. She had expanded what she had to give, and that decision, quiet, unannounced, uncelebrated, had become the loudest thing she ever did. There were no ceremonies, no ribbons or plaques, no names carved in stone, but everyone knew. Everyone who had seen the way he walked beside her, the way she shifted her massive body to shield his small frame from the heat, the way they stood together during storms, him leaning into her side like roots into soil, her trunk resting gently over his back like a memory she never wanted to lose. And that's how they stayed, not always in the center, not always in sight, but always together. When she finally lay down one last time, it wasn't in pain, it was in peace, under the same tree where she had first returned with him. The same patch of earth that had felt her grief now received her gratitude. And he didn't cry out. He didn't panic. He lay beside her, not as a calf afraid of being alone, but as someone who had already learned the most important thing she had ever taught. That love doesn't end, it becomes something else. a presence, a rhythm, a reason, and long after her heartbeat faded, his still echoed in time with where hers had once been. Not to mimic her, but to honor her. And when he rose, he didn't walk away. He stayed until the wind changed, until the light shifted, until the world reminded him gently. It was time to carry her love forward. He does still, in the way he nudges smaller animals toward food, in the way he hums low when the sun sets, as if speaking to someone just beyond the trees, in the way he returns every year to that same tree, not out of sadness, but out of memory, out of thanks, because one day long ago, someone chose to love him when it made no sense to do so. And that changed everything, not in an instant, not with fanfare, but in the way quiet things do, slowly, gently, and all at once. The sanctuary, once built to heal wounds of the body, began tending to the heart. They stopped using the word misfit. They redefined recovery. And when new orphans arrived, some limping, some silent, some refusing to eat, they no longer asked, "Will this animal survive?" They asked, "Who will love them enough to stay?" Because she had shown them that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still beside a shivering body. Sometimes it hums instead of speaks. Sometimes it says, "You don't have to be mine for me to protect you." And that became the legacy she left behind, not just in hoof prints or sun-bleached bones, but in the way a space was made for difference, for grief, for the unspoken. The buffalo, now grown and strong, became a kind of guardian himself, not because he knew how to rescue, but because he knew how to remain, to hold space, to witness. He would linger beside the frightened, graze slower around the wounded, and those who saw him swore he carried something ancient in his eyes. Not pain, not sorrow, but memory. The memory of a trunk curled gently around a small, lost body, of warmth where there should have been loneliness, of belonging born not from blood, but from presence. And that presence outlived them both. Because stories like theirs don't end. They echo. Every time someone chooses to sit beside grief instead of fleeing it. Every time a hand reaches out, not to fix, but to hold. Every time a bond forms across what the world says shouldn't be bridged. Her story is there, breathing, moving, changing things again, because the story never stayed in that sanctuary. It traveled in quiet words between visitors, in the eyes of rangers who stayed long past their contracts, in the way people began to look at animals not as exhibits, but as souls. Some said it was just a fluke, an exception, a curious case of grief. But those who had stood in the heat of that grove, those who had watched a calf too different to belong, being loved as if he'd always been part of something, knew better. They had felt it. That moment when the world shifted, not because something loud happened, but because something kind did. A shift not of power, but of perspective. Love had reached across bloodlines, across language, across what the world once called impossible. And it had stayed. That staying had become the revolution, not in defiance, but in quiet devotion. And now when mothers lose their young, when orphans arrive too small, too scarred, too strange, there is no more panic, no more pity. There is only space made gently for the possibility that someone might choose them anyway. And more often than not, someone does, because of her, because she showed the world that love doesn't ask for sameness. It asks for willingness, to try, to trust, to stay. So when the buffalo walks alone now, sometimes near the grove, sometimes beside new arrivals, people don't see an animal out of place. They see a promise kept, that no heart once chosen is ever truly alone again. And that love, the kind that made no sense at all, still walks the earth. Not in headlines, not in textbooks, but in the space between footsteps, in the pause before a mother turns, in the way a creature, long overlooked, lifts its head and finds someone waiting. You can't map it, you can't measure it, but you know it when you see it. It's in the way he still visits the tree where she once rested, not to mourn, but to be near. Sometimes he stays for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes he brings another. An orphan too young to understand loss, but already carrying it like a second skin. And when he lays beside them, just close enough for them to feel his warmth, they settle. Not because they know who he is, but because they feel who he was loved by. That's the power of legacy born in silence. It doesn't demand to be seen, it invites us to feel. And long after the cameras stop rolling, long after the names are forgotten, long after nature reclaims every path, something will remain. Not a statue, not a plaque, but a rhythm. The rhythm of love choosing, again and again, to return where it was once needed. And in that rhythm, she still moves. Every act of protection, every gentle pause, every moment of unlikely belonging is her, still walking the earth. And so, in a world that so often chooses silence, she chose to stay. Not for recognition, not for purpose, but for one trembling life that hadn't yet learned how to be held. And in that choice, something eternal was written. Not in words, but in footsteps, pressed gently into the soil of a sanctuary that now breathes differently, that listens more closely, that loves more deeply. Because once an elephant who had lost everything made space in her heart for something unexpected. And because of that choice, the world became just a little softer, not quieter, just more willing to stay, to witness, to love. If this story moved you, even for a moment, don't let it stop here. Share it, speak it, carry it forward, because some loves still walk the earth.